Right, I'm here today with Steve Cassidy. I'm Ian Charles from Wizards. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself? Just let us know who you are.
Steve Cassidy, title is Editorial Fellow for PC Pro, IT Pro, Cloud Pro, and Alpha.com, if that's not too long.
Okay, and what are we here today to talk about?
We've got the least noticed subject in British computing at the moment, which is GDPR.
Right, so GDPR is 2017-2018's answer to the Millennium Bug. So what's happening? What's the point with GDPR? What's it all about?
It is a government initiative borrowed from the EU, but it's going to be implemented in the UK with two aims that, to my mind at least, don't actually join up.
Right.
However, both have the weight of regulation behind them. Mm-hmm. One aim is to allow people to pursue the misuse of their name and their address and their other bits of personal data.
Right.
And the other is to, in some way, either prevent or punish leaks of data that are taken out of the building on a USB key or otherwise moved without the data owner's knowledge.
So the reality is it establishes data protection as a human right, as I understand it.
Yep.
Okay, so this protects individuals and consumers, but also places the onus of responsibility on the organisation with whom they exchange their data.
Yes, and there's some crazy things going on. I talked to a man a few days ago from one of the telephone companies who was following a lot of chit-chat about how business cards become a regulated object.
That's absurd.
No, it's really absurd, because he was quite convinced that me giving you my business card does not constitute permission to approach.
Right.
And apparently this is a developing outcome of the way GDPR appears to be implemented. And we are in this gap that you were pointing out. We're in this period where there's a deadline next year. Do you know, I keep forgetting exactly what date it is. All I'm interested in is it's a hard deadline.
25th of May, 2018.
You see, you do dates. I'm not in dates, I'm in sort of impact or other. Mm-hmm. So, in theory, on that day, every business should be able to both respond to requests under GDPR to go and examine what data people are holding, and should be holding it in the right fashion.
Right.
None of the drafted legislation says anything about the nature of business cards. It's an evolving body of regulatory knowledge that is going to hit on that date. But actually, this is why I fed you the line about the Millennium Bug.
Right.
Why I gave you that one, because I remember going through the processes in 1999, and the fact was, the later you picked up the paper, the better you did. The early efforts at fixing the Millennium Bug were all a bit woolly and mistaken and subject to review. Right. So actually, all the hard effort kicked off in about November.
Right. Because
it allowed a summarisation and then an implementation of what was really going on. And I think GDPR is kind of in the same position, where people are beginning to do the research. It doesn't mean that the plan you write in the middle of summer is going to be the one that lasts until the spring.
So, in reality, there is nonetheless this hard date, end of May next year, and you've got to have your ducks lined up and prove that your ducks are in a row at that point.
I don't think it's as hard as a lot of the industry are suggesting. Mm-hmm. I had a conversation with a man whose job title is CEO Security of BT, right, in a position to have a fairly decent opinion on the matter. His view was that date is rather, again, with other precedents in IT, it's a bit like what happens with the software licensing audits and surveys run by our friends in those agencies. They're not looking for missing the final dot on the cross T. They're looking for that flagrant abusers, and there are so many flagrant abusers, it's going to be a turkey shoot. Right. That doesn't mean that you can ignore it, right, by any means.
And you can't ignore it now.
No, because the people with the right to cause you grief is the Information Commissioner's Office.
Right. Who are they?
Well, they are they've gone through a metamorphosis themselves in order to do this thing, but they were the people who handled complaints about loss of data and abuse of data before, but they didn't have very many teeth.
Right.
GDPR gives them the teeth.
Right.
And this is 20% of your turnover as a fee, a fine?
4%.
4% of your turnover?
Up to a maximum of 20 million.
Oh, that's where the 20 was. Right.
Yeah.
So, again, that's a bit like those Millennium Bug early statements that say that the world was all just going to grind to a halt and everything was going to stop. Actually, in reality, it's quite likely to be less than that. But many of the regulators around lots of little industries that aren't necessarily directly in the IT business are going to say, what do you mean you got a visit from the ICO? How many of these have you had? Why are you in trouble with this? And it's going to turn into another burden-driven problem.
Right.
And being honest about what you've got, looked at from the perspective of the requirements of the ICO, it's going to lead to a much nicer Easter bank holiday for next year than it is if you are just eyes shut.
Right. Because
you got to be
Easter's fairly end of March next year.
Well,
Second May bank holiday.
second, yeah, just about. But like I say, there's a soft start, at least in the estimates of our friend from BT. It's far better to do the work now that says not involved, not involved, not involved, not involved, all business to business, cross all that stuff out, and that only leaves how good are we at keeping our data.
Right.
We saw a model for this a few weeks ago in which only one of the subsidiaries of a group needed to register because they were the only bit that was business to consumer.
Right. Right. And that's the key, is it business to consumer?
Well, and yes, because it's individuals' names and addresses.
Okay. And who should clients be speaking to? Who should our customers be speaking to? What do they need to do?
They need to have some independent resource. Existing long-term supporters, all those kind of guys. It's not so much that they're part of the problem, it's that you want an appraisal of how good a job they've been doing.
So somebody outside the business, that's the key. Right.
Yeah.
And what do they bring that you can't, that an insider can't?
Experience of other environments.
Right.
Primary purpose. Secondary purpose is that there's an awful lot of seminars, there's things being done at the House of Commons, all kinds of resources of information. If you've got a real job to do, you're just not going to be in the way of all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I suspect that there will be some industries whose professional bodies are going to take these burdens, because if you're reasonably well-developed pressure washer franchise, let's say, very standardised business, there's no argument about how that business works.
Right.
The Association of Pressure Washer Types, who do, I'm using the example for good reasons, because they've got quite a lot of worries about health and safety.
Right.
So if you're in an industry where there's a body of information of that kind, then the work for GDPR is reproducible across.
Right. Yeah, there's a cookie cutter you can make.
The less standard your business,
Right.
the more disruptive your business, the more you're going to need to work it out from first principles.
Right.
You also have to be slightly careful about what exact business your suppliers are in.
How so?
I'm afraid I got double booked and dunked out of a thing run by Amazon on this exact subject, because a lot of the work GDPR requires you to do is in keeping all of this data encrypted,
Right.
as it's stored and as it moves around and as you mess with it.
Right.
Many systems are going to need either root and branch reform if they've been hand-coded by gap year students. Not that that's a specific example that I've suffered from at all. If you're dealing with something that's hosted in the cloud, or where there are virtual servers that people are using, that service delivery has got to meet GDPR.
Right. Right.
And Amazon was saying, well, do you know what, there's only a few ticks on a few pages in the right bits of the config, and you've lopped off an enormous amount of effort that otherwise you'd have to put in.
Right.
But people don't think about that when they're in that position. And it was also just after the story about the entire electoral roll of the US
Right.
being leaked
Mm-hmm.
because somebody had put it on an unprotected cloud-based server. So there are if you are a very, very modern iPad-only business, and they exist for sure, the exercise changes considerably from, do I recompile this? Do I buy a different product for this? So what about my firewall? Very, very mechanistic one. Over to what's in the contract. Where's the ability of that contract provider to respond to this problem?
Right.
Bizarrely enough, if they're in the EU, they do have to respond
Right.
because the EU is doing GDPR. Well,
Okay, well, on the subject of the EU, there does seem to be some kerfuffle about us leaving the EU.
do you know, I've been so focused on technical matters, I quite missed that.
Right. So where will this affect GDPR?
It only affects it in as much as we're going to have to carry on.
Right.
There's no escape clause, in the sense that if you want to do any business in the EU and you want to sell to any EU citizens, you need to meet their requirements for data protection.
Absolutely.
And conversely, if you think you're going to be dealing with any EU regulatory bodies, it's going to be an easy first question for them to ask. And furthermore, HMG have just said, well, why wouldn't we do this?
Right.
It's a perfectly rational, as close as they get, right? It's a perfectly rational response to the problems, and therefore we're going to follow it in, out, pink, green, devolve, whatever.
Okay. So in short, then there's a there is a finite amount of time in which we've all got to be compliant.
Yep.
You need to be compliant with the requirements of the Information Commissioner's Office. ICO.net is it, or .gov.uk?
I think it's .gov.
Yep. And ideally you should be looking for assistance from outside the business to work with you on that.
Mm-hmm.
Anything we need to add?
I don't think so, because of this whole ticking clock thing.
Yep.
What we need to add is we need to come back and do this in about 6 weeks' time.
Right.
Because the ramp is starting. Information is coming out in practical ways.
Right.
Hopefully, the business card diversion will have been dealt with. Right.
I think the business card diversion is exactly that, isn't it? It's somebody who's over-reading he's reading too much into...
Oh, I totally agree. However, this field is full of that kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely. Well, so is IT. People who the IT world is full of people who overthink things.
Tell me about it. Yeah, it's a watching brief process, and it's the sort of thing where businesses should be trying to find a consulting person or a dedicated agency who can say, well, between now and Christmas we can work out what resources you need.
Yep.
And I believe most of the actual projects in response are going to kick off just after Christmas.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much.
No worries.
Cheers.